Okay, guys, so we are going to try this screen recorder and see if I can get it to work. I haven't gotten much feedback on if the videos you watched from Mandy Rice helped at all, so I'm going to attempt to do my own. Cole, can you please stop? Sorry, there's going to probably be a lot of extra noise in the background. Okay, so intro to sensation and perception. All right, so if you look at this picture on the screen, the question is, do you see anything there? Some of you might start to realize that there is a Dalmatian that's there. If you go, I'm sure you can see my mouse. You have the head there, and then his body extends out towards back, and then you see his legs. It's like he's sniffing the ground over here, and then there's a tree, right? A lot of kids will see that. There's actually nothing there, right? It's just a white space with a bunch of random black spots on it. But because of sensation and perception, you may see things in this picture. Whether you see the Dalmatian, or maybe I've had kids say they see other things. That's fine. Whatever you see, there's actually nothing there. The only reason you think there's something there is because your brain is tricking you into perceiving that, right? We like to pick out things in images especially, or in things we hear. Our brain doesn't like chaos is kind of the rule of this chapter, so it does everything it can to attempt to make sense of the world around us. Now, sensation is our process when the senses use our sensory receptors, and they take this energy from whatever our stimulus is in the world, and it helps us, not make sense of the environment, just receive the environment. So touch, taste, sight, sound, smell, all of that stuff is us picking up on it, not integrating, but taking it into our system. So sensation is just the five senses, or as we'll learn, there's actually more than five, taking them in from the world around us, and that's it. Perception is okay, we took it in from sensation. Perception is I have to actually kind of make sense of it, right? It's the idea that we're organizing and interpreting the information. Whenever we get something into our senses, we have to then turn around and make sense of it. So if we go back to sensation here, our sensory and perceptual processes, they work together, right? So if I was just using sensory for this one, I would just see maybe the shapes, the formations, the colors, which even then my brain is the one that helps perceive color and identify shapes. But sensation is just getting the images. But if we want to keep it kind of less complex right now, sensation would be like you seeing the colors and maybe the shapes. Perception is where you start saying, oh, it's a scene of a forest. Oh my God, there's faces there, right? So in this picture, there's tons of what look like Native American style faces, right? So we have one here. We have another one kind of started there. We have one in the twigs. We have one back here, over here, over here. They're just everywhere, right? They're all over the place. I probably even missed some in there. But there's an array of faces tucked into this picture. And perception is really what lets you see this stuff. And when we talk about perception and expectations, we'll talk about optical illusions in this chapter. It's a really, really fun one to get into. So with sensation, it's just where we gather the information all at once. So our senses are constantly picking up stuff, right? We talked about it with the memory stuff. When you guys have your senses all taking in information to your sensory memory, you're just bombarded with everything all at once, right? And so we have our five senses that are bombarding us. And then we also have to add vestibular and kinesthetic sense, which we'll talk about. But one deals with like balance and body orientation, and the other deals with body positioning in space. So they're super cool things that our body keeps track of, and we are always assessing, but we just never consider them to be part of our main senses when they should be. So your book doesn't talk about it till later on, I believe, because this book is backwards and doesn't follow like every other book we have out there. But you're going to see words like bottom up and top down processing. And to simplify this, bottom up is kind of like sensation. Like that's an easy equatable thing to say between the two. So bottom up processing is where the analysis begins with the sensory receptors and then works its way up to be integrated with sensory information. I bet Mandy Rice did a really good job of talking about this. She's much better spoken about it than I am, so hopefully her stuff made better sense. If it didn't, feel free to ask, and I will try to come up with different ways to explain it. But this picture does a nice job of bottom-up feature processing, like looking at the features are, the shapes, the colors, what are we looking at? It's not what we're looking at, it's just what are the details of what we're looking at. And then we have to climb up the ladder until we get to understanding what we see and processing it better, right? So like word processing, we don't start out with that. When you guys see a word, you see the color of the ink, you see the shapes, and then you recognize it as, oh, this is a letter, and then you process that's an N, that's an R, that's a P. And then eventually you understand, oh, those letters together, they're going to make this word. And then you understand the phrase that all the words are in, and then you comprehend what it says. Like, these are all the steps we go up when we are talking about this bottom-up processing. When you read anything, that's actually what your brain has to do. We just don't think about it because it happens so quickly. So then we get to this perception part, right? This interpreting of the information, understanding what it means. You reading this sentence right here and then saying, oh, I get it, or oh, I understand this, right? Or even if it was like, the dog is blue, you'd know what that means, right? Even though it's illogical, you'd be like, oh, I envisioned a blue dog. It's because you processed it. You perceived what that sentence said and you understood what it was implying, could even like create visual imagery of it. So top-down processing, it is this higher level processing. It is drawing conclusions or drawing understandings of our perceptions and our experiences. So top-down processing, it's a reason why if you read this vertically, it's ABC, and then if you read it across the way, it's 12, 13, 14, right? If you read it horizontally. That shape in the middle, whatever it may be, if we were looking at it and only the shape, you might say it's a B. No, it's a 13. Oh, I don't know which one it is. Depending on the context, I can make you change how you view it. But because you're using top down, using that context, using all these other details, you can make sense of it either if we read it horizontal or horizontal or vertical. It doesn't matter. Your brain can flip between which ones it sees. You're using this top down processing. You're starting out with a higher level of thinking and breaking it down into the specifics. So top-down processing is the same reason that you can fill in the gaps to a sentence like this. So saying, I hope you get a 3 on the AP exam. Some of you probably figured that out pretty quick. I bet most of you did. That's because your brain used top-down processing. It used all its hints. It used all its tips to figure out what was going on in this. Okay. Do you want to say hello?
Hi.
Come over here.
Hi, Mom.
Okay, go play.
Mom, can we buckle my bag?
Yep. So, try as you might, while I buckle up the Power Ranger here, try to read this email. So the reason you are able to read any of this is because you have the ability to do top-down processing. You're using your context clues, you're using your expectations, you're using all this stuff to make sense of everything that's laid out on the screen. Okay, if we use this picture, what is it a picture of? Most people will say a teddy bear. It's not anything, right? It's not a teddy bear. This was actually, Cole, this was actually a, somebody just put the lid down on a Xerox machine and hit copy, and this is the image it spit out. So it's just like the smudge and the dirt marks that were on this Xerox machine. But because your brain is using that top-down processing, we are saying, oh, it kind of looks like a teddy bear, right? It's almost instantaneous just because our brains don't like chaos, and we're like, what's the closest thing in our brain this kind of resembles? And I could, like, you know, totally talk myself into making sense of it. So top-down processing occurs when we use our background information or our experiences to fill in whatever gap. So that Xerox copy, we don't know what it is. It doesn't look perfectly like anything. So our brain scanned itself really fast and said, what is the closest thing I have in my head that looks like this? What experience do I have with anything that resembles this? And we said, oh, a teddy bear. So that's why we think it looks like that, because we used our schema, right? Our experiences, we'll talk about this word schema more later on, but our experiences create a schema or this mental representation of what we expect in the world through. The only way we each know what to expect in the world or what's normal to us is what we've experienced, what we've learned, what we've seen, right? Anything that's personal to us, we create our own schema of what something looks like. So we'll come back to schema again this chapter, and we also talk about it in Unit 4. So read this real quick for me. So most of the time, if you read it out loud, you say flowers bloom in the spring, right? Because that makes sense. but it actually says flowers bloom in the spring. This is something that trips people up because often we know what it's supposed to sound like due to our expectations. So we just say it. We read it that way. And so there may be a lot of things in life that you misread because they were typed incorrectly and you just knew what they were supposed to sound like in your head. So even people who are working at a local newspaper may know what this is supposed to sound like. So Cornhuskers quarterback Zach Taylor will try to beat a team he once played for. It's most of the time how people read it. But if you look at it, it says Zach Taylor will try to beat team he once played for. Okay, there's 2 errors in there, but most people don't pick up on them because we know what it's supposed to say in our head. We see the words. They don't have to be in perfect order. We get it. Just like that email, everything was jumbled, but you could make sense of it, no problem. So sometimes our brain just knows what it's supposed to be, and we just breeze through. All right, the Necker cube, this one's just kind of a fun one to play with. The question is the green dot located in the lower left corner or the lower front corner? So is it in the back or is it in the front? And depending on how you're viewing the box, and some of you can probably flip it back and forth, just an interesting thing how perception can be different or change for each person. All right, so I did see we had questions about the absolute threshold on our Google Doc that you guys were typing on. And so absolute threshold, this is the amount of physical energy or stimulation you need for one of your senses. So we'll just go with the basic 5. One of the senses that you need this much, it's the minimum amount you need to pick up on it only half the time, only 50%, which sounds super weird, but it's like, what is the lowest amount of light that my eyes will pick up on 50% of the time? Because then that means at least if I'm getting it half the time, then I'm registering it pretty solidly. And then that would count as like, what kind of superpower do my senses have? How far can I see light? What is the softest sound I can possibly hear 50% of the time? Because that means my senses are picking up on it half the time or a regular basis, right? And so if we look at what the absolute thresholds are for things, it's just, like I said, the softest sound you can hear, the lightest touch you can feel half the time. All of this is half the time. That's the trick for absolute threshold. The minimum amount of stimulation you need to pick up on a stimuli 50% of the time through one of your senses. So if we look at vision, we have a candle. We can see the flicker of a flame of a candle 30 miles away on a clear night 50% of the time. Or for sound, we can hear the ticking of a watch 20 feet away in a quiet room 50% of the time. Taste. We could taste a teaspoon of sugar dissolved in 2 gallons of water 50% of the time. You know, you wouldn't be like, that's sugar in there. It would be more like, I taste something, the water tastes different, or maybe it tastes a little sweet, right? You'd notice that there was something in the water. And then for touch, this is the weirdest one, but it's also my favorite one because it's so weird. The equivalent of if you laid down and we dropped the wing of a bee a centimeter from your cheek. That's the pressure. So very light pressure. Something like that, just touching your skin, falling on it from a centimeter away. You would notice you felt something and maybe like either feel it or brush at it. And then we have smell. 1 drop of perfume diffused through a 3-room apartment. You would notice that there was a different smell present 50% of the time. So I saw questions about what's the difference between absolute threshold, difference threshold, subliminal threshold. So difference threshold, the amount of change necessary for us to recognize the change has occurred 50% of the time. So it's still the threshold, meaning half the time we have to figure it out, right? Difference threshold would just mean that we pick up on a change, that 2 stimuli are different in some regard 50% of the time. So this could be like the brightness of a light. When do you notice that the 2 lights aren't the same brightness anymore and one is a little brighter than the other? 50% of the time. What's the minimum difference that has to be there? 50% of the time. So they call it just noticeable difference. It's the same thing. So on a test, hypothetically, you could be asked something about the just noticeable difference, and then another question, they could talk about the difference threshold. It's the same exact thing. It's just a different term for the same principles, right? And so when we look at the difference, 1 second, my kid's making all this noise. Let me pause for a sec. All right, sorry, he's being all crazy today. with this difference threshold, when do you notice things have changed? So let's say like